Hey man,
Uh, yeah.
good to
Good
meet
afternoon. Yes, good to meet
you.
you. Huh?
So give me 1 minute, okay? I'm just going to do
Yeah.
something and then I'll be back. That's okay because it wasn't open before. And I didn't have
Ah,
time to open it. Yeah, that's better. That's
ah,
good.
nice, 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 nice. Wow. This
How
is
are you?
such a I'm good, I'm good. Thank you. I'm in Berlin. I guess you are in
In London, in London.
great, great,
I was
great.
very struck by uh, your your itinerary. I thought, oh, okay. So you're based in Berlin, you teach in Berlin, right? Or
Yes, I teach in Berlin and I also like working in this transdisciplinary way where I'm doing, teaching, but also other project as well. And
Mhm.
it's also part of that. It's like, okay, I've been following your work for a long, but I'll get into that. You know, I'll get into all of that. But this idea of the transdisciplinary and working across mediums, but also so like all these moving parts, that is very much a function of that post-colonial discourse. How do you really bring it all together? So yeah, yeah.
You've been in Berlin a while now, or like
Yes, yes. I've been in Berlin for about 8 years, and yeah, yeah.
nice?
Um,
I
so
it was one of those places I was always fascinated by, and always thought maybe I might end up there, but I didn't move fast enough. By the time I became aware of it as a desirable space, like it all gone.
yeah,
It
yeah.
was having it already been snapped up by some other artist. I'm like, okay, well, whatever. I'll
Yeah,
stop.
I mean, yeah, yeah, Berlin, it can be such a it has a history. So like, it has a
Mm,
history of tolerance for, but it's sort of like playing all that cat and mouse between Berlin as a place for creativity and Germany as this bureaucratic, you know, institution.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's it really. So yeah, it's such a privilege and an honor to be able to have this window. So much that I grabbed it. Can you imagine, like, just on the corner here, I have my son because I had to go and pick him up from school and bring him
Oh,
to the
wow.
studio. So I just don't, like, so like we,
Yeah,
it's like
yeah.
it's amazing.
Oh, I'm
So thank you
sorry.
so much. Yeah, no problems, no problem at all. It's like we're gonna make this happen. So I this is Nkata Podcast
Hmm.
um project, and I started putting it together in 2020,
Hmm.
and it took off really during the COVID.
Okay.
And the central idea behind it is to, because I've looked at that, all of that artistic process that, started all the way from, it's almost like galvanized by all of the independence movement and into the 21st century. And I realized that barring the lack of art schools, properly, stable art schools, and even when it comes to photography and film in
Mm,
the continent, we don't have a place that is really articulating these processes.
mm,
So it's here and there. So the podcast is the idea is to speak to, you know, practitioners who have been able to articulate it through their own process and even invented their own process of doing that. Because that's another thing that we overlook is that there's a lot of invention going on there in terms of the DIY, the do how you get to put all of this together, which is what I hope we are going to also touch on the podcast. So yeah, um, if you may, I'll make a formal introduction and then we'll start.
okay.
Yeah. All right. So um, hello everyone and welcome to yet another episode of Nkata Podcast, Art and Processes. Today, I have the privilege and the honor of speaking with the Ghanaian-born British artist, John Akomfrah, and I'm thrilled to have you join us as we glimpse into the incredible world of this legendary artist and filmmaker, whose work is an in-depth, profoundly poetic preoccupation with themes like memory, post-colonialism, and the experiences of migrant diasporas around the world. John Akomfrah first made waves as a founding member of the Black Audio Film Collective back in 1982. Alongside his collaborators, David Lawson and Lina Gopaul, he launched his film career with the groundbreaking film Handsworth Songs. This 1986 film examined the 1985 riots in Birmingham and London and introduced John's signature style of a rich blend of archival footage, still photos, and newsreels. It's a style that has continued to captivate audiences and critics alike. Throughout his career, John has created some seriously powerful films and installations that make us question societal norms and think deeply about the world around us. So far, there's over 20, his filmography, constitutes about over 20 films. And some of them that I really retain for myself here, thinking about it, is the following: The Unfinished Conversation, Nine Muses, which I'm watching and rewatching and even introducing in my class because I bought the film directly from the website, you know. The Stuart Hall Project, also the Vertigo Sea that I was opportune to see in Barcelona, Purple, Mimesis, Four Nocturnes, Becoming Wind, and of course, recently I was in Washington, D.C., and I saw Five Murmurations that you created during the COVID, and it was really based on that. This is a three-screen installation, and this is something that is a running thread across in some of the works that I have seen myself. So yeah, there's a lot more, in fact, that goes definitely beyond the scope of this podcast. So I really invite you to, you know, Google that name and just get lost in that, carefully arranged labyrinth of, all his works around films. So, yeah, that's it really. With no further ado, it's my privilege and honor to say welcome to Nkata Podcast, John Akomfrah.
Like that's such a generous, such a kind, considerate, insightful introduction, and very, very, very appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm super excited to do this and to have you here. But as I was thinking about all of this, all of today, it struck me that you were born there's 2 days, just 2 days, short of 2 months after the Ghanaian independence in Accra.
Yes.
So I would like us to begin there. Please give us a sense of what it was like to be born into that, all the anecdotes, all the stories that, and how perhaps how that you've carried that along into who you've become today.
I mean, I think, this is one of the things that growing up in England, you don't get much time to reflect on. But certainly when I'm with my relatives, many of whom are gone now, but the elder relatives, my aunties and uncles, this was something that was brought home very forcefully to me. The idea that I was what Simon Rushdie called a midnight child, somebody who's born on that wave of optimism that was Ghanaian independence, not just for Ghanaians, I have to say, but because many, many people from across the continent who, when they find out when I'm born, also say, oh yeah, like I remember that. Of course, not many do now because my age being what it is, many of these folks have passed away. But you couldn't speak to Usman Sembène, for instance, or Lionel Ingakani, or many of these great figures that I encountered as a young man on the African film scene without them mentioning this. Oh, you're 57. And certainly for my parents, this was a very, very big deal. I've tried to piece together what it would have been like to have grown up under well, growing up in colonial Ghana, put it that way, you know. And in a way, we've addressed this. I addressed this in one of the voiceovers in Handsworth Songs, where a group of servants start to try and imagine what the world would be with their own children in it. Because to imagine a world with your children in it is to imagine a future for yourself.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people who don't want a future go, oh, no, it's too early. No, I wait small. It's too early to have children. So to bring children into the world is a way of acknowledging futurity. It's utopian.
Yes.
You are making claims on the coming future and making qualitative claims on it. You want it to be better. You want it to be safe. You want it to feel a space of peace, which is why you're having children in it. Otherwise, you try not to. So I have felt this sense of privilege, which, as I said, only really means anything to people who understand the date. If you don't, then it doesn't really matter. And of course, as I grow older, many people don't know the date, and so it doesn't matter. But yes, it's something that I was made aware of very early on.
Yeah.
And it's one of the markers,
Yeah.
one of the milestones in my life,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
sense that this is my inheritance,
Yeah. Yeah.
the child of independence, basically.
And it seems to me, looking at, how you've moved, again, you went to England at the age of, I think, 8,
Mhm.
if I'm correct. Um, and and that was where everything played out. But also, you are thrust into this very vibrant moment of, um, I think of it as, like everything is up for grabs,
Yeah.
and and you came into it strongly that way.
Mm.
Um, but again, I just thinking, with all the whole currents and everything going on, how were you able to find your place in all of that in a way that you were like sure that this was exactly how you want to go about it? And yeah.
I mean, I think I'm one of those um, people whose sense of themselves was um, formed in collaboration with others. Um, you know, because of the age that we lived and grew up in. I think there's something similar is happening now to young people of color. Where you feel a kind of generational coming of you. You feel like you're connected to something else. The beginnings of the 2000s were not like that. They were very fractured and very, but in basically what I'm saying is this, when I arrived, and you're right to stress the difference, because the Ghana I left as a child was a Ghana of real fear. It felt you felt as if you were in trouble in some way. You felt threatened. by, so I understand what most refugees now feel like. I understand what it feels like to feel as if the doors have closed on your future in a place and that you need to move. You need to find the elsewhere that will then reopen that door into the utopian for you. I really understand that. Um, but it's not just that I understand it. I understand it emotionally. I understand what that space feels like emotionally, you know. Um, and conversely, I also understand the space of arrival, why people try so hard to get to some of these spaces in Europe. Because I understand what it feels like to arrive somewhere where you suddenly get this sense that your world is opening up again, having had it shut.
Exactly, exactly.
You
Mhm.
know, you feel like you're in a space of the opportune. You're in a space of potential fortune. You're in a space of possibility.
I think at this point you've really touched on something that is very, very interesting. I was in Tangier last year. Tangier. Tangier is just 14 kilometers away from Spain.
Yes.
And I was there with a friend, an anthropologist friend, and we were doing this sort of like photographer, anthropology, and anthropologist, sort of like together, working together in concert. And part of what I was thinking was exactly this, because oftentimes people think of migrants coming as, oh, you are coming to take up space here.
Mm,
But
mm,
I feel like they are thinking of it as, why can't my dream open up
yes.
into something? And I don't see it so much as if they are thinking of the West as a destination, as it is an opening
Mm,
of that dream, of that possibility that they carry in them, that they feel an inkling that they
mm,
feel that they have in them. So in other words, the West is not really the destination.
mm,
It is, if given the opportunity,
mm.
they will want to dream, they will want to see what it's like to,
Yes.
to open. I don't know if that's basically what you're
Absolutely.
referring to. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I mean, several writers and thinkers have tried to, describe this condition, you know, um, whether it's Naipaul and his enigmatic arrivals I mean, people have tried to essentially um, open up the space for us. I mean, for me, it was always this feeling that I tried to capture in sections of Handsworth Songs and almost set in the Nine Muses, which is that the idea of journey in itself is a utopian quest.
Yeah.
And it's like an investing in the utopian possibilities of the elsewhere,
Mhm.
which is, for you, the place of arrival,
Yeah.
right? And until you're in that space of arrival, um, you're not going to be completely satisfied, which is why somebody will go to Lampedusa and think, oh, no, 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 I want to be in London,
Mhm.
right? Because the ideal, the space of true becoming that they have for themselves doesn't fit what they see in Lampedusa, let's
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
right? They want that germination to be elsewhere. So it's a kind of immense faith in the elsewhere,
Mhm.
which is in many, many ways wasted on the elsewhere. Because like at the moment, there are all these guys, um, right-wing racist guys marching the streets in England saying we don't want any more boat people, go home, and burning down hotels and all this stuff. And it's almost like for them, they can't imagine how much of an investment in this place these figures embody. Because they don't believe in this space themselves in quite that way.
Yeah. Exactly.
This
Exactly.
is part of the problem. There's a conceptual disjunct between what a white northern working class man who is unemployed in now feels about England
Mhm.
or Britain, and what, someone who's left, Sudan,
Mhm.
um, who's arriving here now feels.
Mhm.
This is a space of immensity,
Mhm.
of growth, and it's an investment. It's a belief in this place.
Yeah.
you
Mhm.
know, it's a belief in this place that the inhabitants of it now don't share.
Exactly. Exactly. E- Exactly. It's almost as if there is a kind of intensity.
Yes,
You are stressing on this belief. And each and every one of us know this because we are like, for me now, and there's this belief, like it's almost like it is very, very close to anything you could call just being viscerally human
yeah,
in that sense, breathing. Yet, you get a sense that, the people you're mingling with, the people you are interacting with every day, just take it at face value and just like, okay, this is just, a kind of a birthright
yes.
that we have. And there's a disconnect in that sense.
There's a massive
There.
disconnect.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think one of the things which has happened to me quite a lot recently is my travels across the world has taken me into places where you can feel the vitality of these new multiculturalisms.
Mhm.
It might not necessarily be uh, in places like Northern England, but I mean, if you go, for instance, to the UAE, which I was in very often. I've
Yeah.
been in very often over the last 4 years, whether it's
Mhm.
Sharjah, you know, Abu Dhabi or somewhere, you immediately, whether you're staying in a hotel or you're on holiday, you immediately encounter lots of young people, many of whom would never get into Europe, many of whom the doors of Europe are now completely closed to. And
Mhm.
they're from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Kenya, you know, and they are so alive. You can feel it's almost like the first indications of what it would have been like for people arriving in Europe just after the war.
Mhm.
That sense of the promise of a place
Yeah. Mhm.
that you're about to encounter or that you've encountered that may not, it's not really about whether the place is friendly, quote unquote, or even welcoming. It's just what it embodies, what it is
Mhm.
capable of embodying
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
you can feel it. So I meet a security guard, and he's from Kenya and in Dubai airport, and you say, how is it? Because it's hard. I mean, he's not used to this. He's getting up at 5 in the morning, every morning. No, he's reporting to work at 5 in the morning every morning, which means he has to be up at 4. So his life is just the work, and he's
Mhm.
leaving at 8 or 9. So he's basically living for work. But I mean, this guy is living literally the dream.
Mhm.
You he feels as if he's in the center of something which is going to make his life more meaningful.
Yeah.
Certainly than it would have been in rural Kenya, certainly than it would have been trying to get on a boat and get to Europe. He's settled, he's alive, he feels he's riding the crest of luck, the wave of luck and good fortune. And it's nice to see that. It's nice to see that in the world where um, let's just call them actually existing multiculturalisms are currently being formed, not simply in Europe, but in other parts of the world. And
Yeah.
you can see what we're talking about in embryo or in action. Um, and I really believe this to be one of the profound human gestures, which when places lose insight into, they start to desiccate and die. When you forget that the arrival of the new is how the old always changes itself. when you forget that simple human lesson, then you're dying.
Yeah.
And you're dying in a tragic way, you know.
Wow. Wow. You know, that's so powerful because, it's almost as if it encapsulates this move from the 20th century into the 21st, which is how I sort of like define or think of the frame of our practice, our that in that post-colonial, that idea of the post-colonial is still only playing out really now. Um, and I remember you saying that part of what has sustained you is the collaborations and living in the collective. And in
Yeah.
1982, you formed the collective, um, the Black Audio Film Collective.
Yes.
Um, can you sort of like give me a sense of
Sure.
what that did? Because I guess that was also where you made your debut as a
Yes.
filmmaker. Yeah, so yeah.
Yes. No, I mean, in a way, the collective itself, formally starting off, was the culmination of something because half the people in the collective, Lina, Gopaul, Ivor Johnson, Riso Geist, and myself, had met as school kids in 77, 76, 77. So we'd known each other. By 82, we'd known each other for 6 years. We'd been through um, further education, colleges, universities together, right? And the forming of the collective really started to make sense when we got to Portsmouth Polytechnic on the South Coast and started to meet other people,
Yeah.
other students, all black, um, all pretty much asking the same questions. Really, that was, there was, I mean, one of the things that I think race and racializing narratives uh, uh, have, it's one of its few positive consequences is that it forces shared relations, shared social relations onto large conurbations and populations and groups who would otherwise not necessarily have those, convivial relations. So if you're living in a place where the nature of policing or the nature of social service or whatever is basically operating in these incredibly discriminatory ways, so that the minute you open your mouth in a conversation with somebody else, you realize that you've had the same experience. you know, whether it's a policing or social service or school, or you've had the same experiences, and so you've almost been molded and formed to behave in the same way,
Yeah.
right? Um, Now, you still have to act on that. It's not like an automatic process. There's no automatic way in which facing discrimination together then makes you all creatives together or all intellectuals together or all activists together. You still have to work through that space. But I think um, where you are um, certainly the bright and intelligent and articulate and ambitious members of that community begin to realize that partly what they have to do is to name who they are, where they think they're living, how they think they're living. You have to begin this process of naming. Um, and so the question of inscription, how you write yourself into the moment, becomes absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And I just happened to be surrounded by people, all of whom shared that that assumption about the value of inscription, the importance of the signature.
It's
Uh,
amazing that you talk about inscription. Is this
yes,
basically what you've been doing for every single project? The idea of reinscribing. knowing that it is never enough. It is the, an act of perpetual writing yourself into. Does that,
Yes. No,
is
I
it?
mean, I think you've definitely got your finger on something there. The question of inscription is absolutely critical to me.
And it's
And
cyclical because that's how something comes into being and
yes,
takes on
yes,
meaning
yes.
by that cyclical movement of inscription and reinscription.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's Nietzschean in that sense because it's forever unfinished.
Mhm.
It remains the quest. And that's necessarily the case because the circumstances, the conditions, the relations that one is forced into, surrounded by, confronted with, and so on, necessarily changes
Mhm.
time. So of course it's going to be unfinished. What it feels like to be a 50-year-old working on a project is not the same as a 60-year-old, and it almost certainly isn't the same as a 30-year-old. So just in my own life, just thinking about the ways in which I have been addressing things or trying to work on things changes. But there are certain constants.
Mhm.
And some of those constants have to do with the fact that you know this is about trying to make sense of your life. It's about trying to make sense of where you sit in the constellation of things, and by you, I don't mean just you necessarily always as an individual, but where you sit with your, network of affinities, friends, family, and so on, community, and so on, inside the constellation of things that one could call the modern world. you know, um, I know that much because I've had like uh, many people of my generation. I had the good fortune of knowing that that the question of inscription has overwhelmingly valuable results. Like if you strive to be seen as a child of the hyphen
Mhm.
and you win, there are bonuses. In other words, if you can get your society to accept who you are, say, okay, we're going to stop calling you a Negro and a colored, we'll call you Black British. That's what you want, right? Okay, that's what you want. That's what we'll call you. You're Black British now. When you can get a society to accept that, you realize the value of inscription. You realize the value of writing yourself into a scene because then you're doing things on your terms. Doesn't mean that you necessarily win everything. Doesn't mean you're happy with everything. It doesn't even mean that you're going to get necessarily what you want in the long run. But at least the terra firma on which the enunciative modalities of your life announce themselves are ones that you've at least chosen.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And it's amazing. Is it like, because again, of course, obviously where I'm going to here is to get a sense of, like to zoom out and to get a sense of how you have been able to layer it one after the other. Not only are you prolific, but you are also methodical. And I'm thinking to myself, there's all these moving parts,
Mm.
and then add to that moving images, you know. Um, and still you've been able to sort of like bring it all of it together. Because conceptually we can talk about the idea of superimposition, juxtaposition, and creating, unstable images or
Oh,
sites that,
yes.
makes the whole image unstable. We can talk about that in theory. But in practice, coming from that post-colonial um angle, some people have likened your work and your engagement to the cinematic, version or counterpart of commentators such as Stuart Hall and you know Frantz Fanon and then but cinematic, So again, what they have been able to do on this level of the academia, you were able to do within the medium. And how were you able to really like um put all of that together in that way? What was the process like?
I mean, initially there were a couple of fights that we had to win as a group of artists, and it's the fight that the avant-garde always has to make for itself. You have to get people to accept that there is a kind of politics of form, and that the formal questions raised by your existence, your ideas, are not ones that are solved just by resorting to some rhetorical question from the academy, or you know what I mean. There's work to be done.
Yeah.
In saying you are either a filmmaker or an artist, there's work to be done. And that's not going to be helped by you reading a book or trying to write a book. Which is, if you know me, you know that that's not an anti-intellectual statement at all. It's more just respecting the necessary autonomy of things. And we had to fight a lot for that, because when we started, people will call you up and say, "Oh, we're having a demonstration. Maybe you can come and film it." Because the idea was that what you did was just in the service of something else, political demonstrations or political activity. That's what you did. You were just there to service. Or they'll say, "Oh, why are you trying to do something so complicated? Why don't you just make something that everybody can understand?" As if your only role, right, is to enable other things to happen. The practice itself has no value in and of itself. So trying to get people to take the practice, the value of the practice seriously, was important. I mean, I suppose in a way we're kind of gliding slowly towards the question of aesthetics, because in a way, what made, I think, my generation of artists, yeah, unique in a way was that we moved out of the shadows of the political, not by disavowing it, as some of the earlier generations had done, so I'm just an artist or I'm just a filmmaker, not by, the simple refusal, but by holding up a mirror of autonomy to both, both the political and the culture, to say, yeah, yes, of course we are what you think we are. We are people of color. But that doesn't automatically then tell you or prescribe the kinds of works that we would do, especially if you think the works should be quote unquote conventional, mainstream, yada, yada, yada. In fact, one of the things that I argued for years, I didn't necessarily win it, but I argued for it anyway, in our circle, was for us to refuse the categories of artist, filmmaker, because it felt to me that, in 82, when we had the Black Art Conference, people already said, "Oh, as Black artists," or, "Are we artists or just Black artists?" And you think, okay, this conversation is already dead. It's already redundant because you're reducing yourself, before you even got going, to already received categories, Black artists or artists. Who cares? Who wants to be these things? The thing is, you don't know. You may well, in your practice, begin to evolve in such a way that the need for either categories will be redundant. You could come up with something else, but let's not give up on that by accepting the prescribed before we got going. I mean, I didn't win that one.
Yeah. But
But I
this
wanted to
sounds
argue anyway.
this sounds somewhat, close to argument that like coming out of that space of the intellectual, the academia,
Yeah,
and getting into, popular culture and saying, well, nothing is really stable It is just one step, and then something else can open up. Does it have to do with, that kind of like being in that,
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah,
yeah.
I see what you mean. I mean, there was um also the sense for a very long time that what we were doing was merely fleshing out some of the insights that writers and theories like Stuart Hall or had. That these were just the rehearsals, narrative or visual rehearsals um, of their work, and I I would answer that by saying two things. One, Stuart Hall was, as a figure, was very important for me, and a number of us,
Hmm.
involved in the Black Art movement, certainly the Black film movement. He was very important because he had been, he essentially his life mirrored ours. He started his journey as an academic and a writer and a thinker, um, or he came into his own doing that in the very early 60s when he started to look at popular forms and culture and so on. And this was roughly the same time as we were coming. Do you need to check something? Because if you
Yeah,
do,
let me just one
of
second.
course.
All right. Okay, we're
You
good.
do? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I
Yeah.
could see that, but I thought, all right.
Yeah.
But yeah, so my thing was we were kind of roughly, we as children, him as a young adult, began the same time. So the reasons we gravitated towards him was because he knew who we were. He was one of the few intellectuals in this country, black or white, male or
Hmm.
female, who from 64 onwards was following the trajectory, biographical trajectory of my generation.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
wrote about them, he made radio programs about us, really from 64 onwards, So when you read his stuff or when you met him or spoke to him, you felt that sense of intimacy. You felt that sense of shared journey together. Um, but but the work that we were trying to do was not merely to just provide visual flesh to his theoretical skeleton. I mean, that wasn't what we were trying to do. In fact, in some cases, there were real disagreements about that. I mean, like when I wanted to make the unfinished conversation with him, and he was happy for that to happen,
Yeah.
because it was a collaborative thing until he started to feel very ill and couldn't do it anymore. And so we carried on. Um, on the Stuart Hall project, on the other hand, he didn't want to do at all.
Uh-huh.
He didn't feel this was important, and I had to insist. Look, we're going to do this, whether we have your blessing or not, because I think it's important for people to know the breadth of the thinking around some of these subjects. So that was not with his blessing. In other words, even what appears to be just the fleshing out of his thought with our visual, clay wasn't with his agreement. Because I don't think people should see um, these as completely harmonious relationships. They
And
were.
what was his pushback on that? Just,
His
briefly.
pushback was that he didn't want something biographical to be made
Ah.
his life, right?
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I would say, okay, it's not a complete biography in that sense, but these things are difficult to explain
Hmm.
be- because the explanation itself has still to be made. What a film feels and looks like is not the same as what it is to talk about it. You know?
Does it come from his certain kind of like, aversion for, so like having something like fixed?
Yes,
Was it thinking about it that way?
that, and also I think, he has been a collaborative subject, all his life. Whether working at the New Left Review or, the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. And, I mean, Stuart was more comfortable being part of things, right? Which is an unusual thing to say for someone who's written so much on his own and done so much to push our understandings of things as him. But he was uncomfortable with the idea of a piece which is just about him. And he had to be persuaded, that this is a necessary project. Okay, part of what we had to persuade him of is me saying, okay, you might not do this yourself. You might not even think it's a good idea yourself, but this isn't yours.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? We reserve the right to make something of you, with you, and about, kind of in a way where we grow up.
And at this point, I also want to sort of like talk about the fact that you were the one who eventually made that film.
Mm,
It makes me think about, from what I have seen so far of the films, it's like there's a certain kind of like a collectiveness or a collective voice that there's
yes,
a way your approach, feels like you echo things, you echo it out. It's not like an echo chamber, it's not an echo chamber. It's more like echo of voices.
yes.
We watch your film, we see that there is a sense of the collective
Mm,
in there a lot.
mm,
And I feel like if you are asking him like we have to do this,
mm.
that you're basically saying we can actually give it that feel of the collective, even though, you know, um,
Absolutely. In a way, a graphic illustration of what we're both saying
mhm,
is to do with the music of the film. That's your whole project. So in the beginning of the film, he says, when I was very young, Miles Davis, the musician, jazz musician Miles Davis, put his finger on my soul. And I thought, oh, okay, that's an interesting point. Because if Miles Davis put his finger on your soul when you're very young and you're still listening to Miles Davis now, it means that in a way, Miles Davis has been the soundtrack for your
mhm.
life.
Yeah.
And that means that we can actually go to Sony and buy all the Miles Davises that we think would perfectly illustrate, uh, function as a soundtrack to your life. And just that alone changes the whole dynamic of the piece. Because
Mhm.
he himself is suddenly now being ghosted and overdetermined, if you will, by a silent guest, Miles Davis. So suddenly it's not just a film about him. It is, but it's not just about him because Miles Davis is there, providing a kind of sonic portrait of the 20th century,
Mhm.
of which still happens to be, an exemplary kind of uh, member of, So um, things like that are difficult to explain, as I said, because there's almost like a post-literary justification, post-textual justification for how moving images work, even as
Yeah.
text. Um, that means that you have to make the practice, you have to make the work, because once you've done it, it itself has a way of speaking, which isn't just what writing or commentating does. It has its own ontology, if you will. And that will, I always knew, I mean, the one faith I always have in all of these works is that however much they appear to mirror somebody, Melville or Virginia Woolf or Stuart Hall, or however many ways you think they're referring to a historical past, Biafra or DD, whatever. In the end, the works themselves have a certain aura, you know,
Definitely,
Benjaminian,
definitely.
yeah, Benjaminian glow, which is
Yeah.
the vanity of the project itself. This is where
Hmm.
this is me.
Hmm.
I'm not
Yeah.
Virginia Woolf or Biafra.
Yeah.
I'm me. I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
can
And we get a sense of a certain kind of um almost like a very silent ambition
mm,
behind your work. It's like, okay, it's poetic. I want to present this to you, but I also want to show you that this is an ambitious, daring. I'm saying I'm pushing the medium to be
mm,
daring. And I
mm,
see this first in the Vertigo Sea, that's
mm,
one. And then secondly in Nine Muses,
mm, mm,
in the way that you have really gone for, I would like to talk about Nine Muses now.
mm.
Um, in the way you've gone for the mythology of, you it's almost like going for the heart of it
Yes.
and repurposing all of that. Please, can you talk about, you know, talk about that idea of the going for the mythology of it? It's almost like you're going for the core.
Yeah, I mean, definitely trying to go for the quote unquote core, um, in two very specific ways. One was by the time I made Nine Muses, I spent a lot of time talking to uh, people from the so-called Windrush generation.
Mm.
The people who arrived in this country from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean
Yeah.
between eight and 68. Um, and I was always struck by how they presented their arrival here, in three quite different ways. Usually they would say, however they got here, uh, boat usually. There was, oh, it was very lonely. I felt very alone, and you realize actually, this is it's a condition, it's a psychic state rather than a physical biographical thing, because you see all these people standing on a boat together and you think, well, you can't have been lonely. There are 400 of you. But that's not what they mean. They mean solitude. They mean being alone in a very different sense.
Mhm.
And then there was also the sense that they always said, oh, we felt like we were, when they arrived, they were a bit too colorful and, you know, um, you think, oh, okay, that's interesting. So there was a sense of apartness which was defined for them by sartorially. They felt like, oh, we were either overdressed or underdressed or something. There was a kind of sartorial difference between them and what they saw as a host. And the last was that they were always talking about, setting off on this journey usually without any um, feeling that they were going to get here. You know? And I suddenly realized that actually all of the descriptions of the journey were Homeric in the true sense of the word. They were Odyssey-like in the sense that um, it mirrors the kind of uh, narrative outline of the Homeric epic. you know, they leave, they go through several adverse conditions, and they finally arrive, quote unquote. But the point of arrival is such a transformation that the person who left is not anymore the person who arrived. Patrick Chamoiseau speaks about this. I mean, lots of people have spoken about this, but it felt usually for talking about arrival in the new world. And I thought actually there was something to be done with the opposite.
Mhm.
People coming from one old world to another old world, as it
Yeah.
were. Um, the ways in which modern diasporas, began to to take shape in the post-war period. So the choice of the Homeric, the choice of the epic, and of the nine muses to speak fractures of this condition were very deliberate. And listen, I took a lot of flack for it. There are people who were like, "Why are you doing this? This is all white stuff."
Oh, it feels to me like it is, especially when I introduce this film to my students in the class and I show them, it's like it feels to me like it's a film that 20 years from now you get to understand exactly why, because it feels like it is where we are going. It is, you know, and
Mm,
this is for me, I feel like this is a running thread in also in the way you use the material, and is creating these spaces of paradoxes, these moving bodies as they move, as they cross these borders, paradoxes ensue. And we call it contradictions, and we call it schizophrenia. We call it, it doesn't make sense. You leave, but you don't arrive. You arrive, but you don't leave. Things like that. And I see that recurrent. And in Nine Muses, it was very much treated. It was almost like, forget about the two, polarity, like the two polarities of leaving and then arriving. We have arrived.
mm.
But we know that, many people who arrive, they never really arrive to the ones who they left back home, because it's like, when are you going to come back? You never come back anymore, you know? And you are able to treat the in between,
Mm.
like the complications of it, the how bodies move and get stuck in this spiral of and then using uh that mythology there to ground all of that. It's not a white thing. It's it's
I
a
know,
it's a
I know.
whole.
I mean, I've always, you say to people, actually, it's the blackest thing.
Exactly.
It's the blackest thing I've ever
You
done.
know, yeah.
But I mean, I think part of it is also just getting people to realize something that had become one of the paradoxes in my life. So for instance, one of the reasons why the Nine Muses was necessary was, it was around about that time when my mum was like, I need to go home. And like, what does she mean home? um, so yeah, there was this paradox, and she described it as a kind of elastic band that you stretch, and at some point it reaches its absolute taut position, where the only way it can go is either snapping completely or flying back.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And she was like,
Wow.
"I've reached that." And I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So, um, human beings, and we as people of African origin clearly um, came into a space where you thought um, um, things will remain forever open,
Mhm, mhm.
right? Forever a space of possibility, without also taking on board the question of memory, without taking on board the question of inheritance and legacy, that somehow these things also have over determining features, roles in your life. You know, and so one of the reasons why you may not completely arrive is because the elsewhere that you left never completely lets you go. You might not always belong to it, but it never completely leaves you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you're never going to be, people speak to me in Ga, the language of the people of Accra, and I'm still amazed that I
Mhm.
understand it. I'm still amazed that I understand that I can speak quite a lot of it. I'm still amazed that the indentations in it, the kind of the weird meanings of it, the untranslatable elements of it
Yeah.
still make sense to me, you know.
Yeah. It's almost as if it's like almost like an inner language now.
Yes. And it's not, I haven't made any special effort to retain it. Like, I mean,
Wow.
but I still have it. I'm still literally, I can occasionally remember a song, and you try and translate the song from Ga. I mean, there are a few high life songs from E.T. Mensah, for instance, that are sung in Ga, and one in particular is about leaving, you know, to go abroad and saying
Mhm.
goodbye to a lover. But I mean, the way in which the song is performed, devised, and resonates, it's almost you can't translate that. Well, yes, you can translate it, and there are equivalencies, but there's something about the song which is wholly gone that will never, you'd never be able to take out of. you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah.
Um, in many ways, that's what my mum's "I Want to Go Home" uh, felt like to me. I
Felt
was,
like, yeah.
okay, so
Wow.
you've done 50 years, but you're still like hankering for some sort of respite
Yeah,
from
yeah,
the journey, which
yeah.
you consider home to embody or represent for you. And she went, and when she went, she didn't exactly move into family homes or what she'd left. She went into the bush and built something in a place that had no electricity. So it wasn't even going back home. It was going back
Mm-hmm.
to the home of her childhood when
Yeah.
most of Accra was basically bush.
Wow. Wow.
And that's where she died. But
Wow.
of course now that place, which was all bush, is not anymore all bush because time itself is, claimed both the space that she was after and her. So she's now been sucked into um sucked into contemporary Ghana, even though what she wanted wasn't contemporary Ghana at all. She thought she wanted, but she didn't. She actually wanted an older Ghana, basically a Gold Coast. But she hadn't, which is all very interesting for me, for a political animal who is an anti-colonial activist to hanker for a place that was a place of her. Anyway, I think you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But as you're also speaking, as you're saying this, I'm also thinking for you, you know, how is all of this playing out? You've been engaged in this conversation for, largely, all your life and carrying it all the way into the 21st century and even being able to treat it within the context of the recent pandemic
Mhm.
that also sort of like brought the world together in a kind of a rhyme. How are you thinking about this whole idea? If we use your mother's analogy as well, this idea of going back but
Mm.
not going back. How is it playing out for you personally?
I mean, and I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned five memorations because it'd be good to see whether I can situate some of my thinking about the question around that piece. So you're you're stuck in England at the time of the COVID pandemic, and in the middle of all of that, um, a figure, George Floyd, gets killed uh, by a police officer in in the States, and is killed in such a way that suggests a mirroring of pandemics,
Yeah.
essentially.
Mhm.
Because he seemed to be one of um, several who, in a very short space of time, died by the hands of basically irresponsible police officers in the state, racist police officers in the states. So you start to think about the ways in which Dublin's play the roles they play both in your life and in the life of others. Mm. And the whole of Five Memorations evolves from this simple premise
Yeah.
of mirroring the ways in which, one possible catastrophe holds a mirror to the other, and I started to then trying to see the ways in which we live with catastrophe, right, in our lives, because when you're a figure of color, whose life is premised on a kind of visible difference, skin color in this case, there's always a way in which, your life's kind of haunted by certain coming. So what happened to George Floyd is something that oftentimes, if you are Black, you have thought about as a possibility for you, that you'd find yourself in a situation where you are in danger, not because of anything you've done, not because of anything you've said or done, but because you stand out as a figure of color. And you think, oh, okay, well, if this marks me out as a figure for special attention, then I must also think about the ways in which philosophically and ethically there are implications to this. If every figure of color is also potentially a George Floyd, because what marks him is not something that he did, but something that he is, which is also what you are.
Yeah.
Then your proximity to him is actually very close. Philosophically, that means that there's a way in which you can generalize something about your lives into a kind of a core, as you call it. And I was very keen to then see the ways in which one could call that a coming.
Mm-hmm.
A coming of disaster, a coming of dread, a coming of killing, a coming of violence, a coming of, how the complicated ways in which to be Black is to face the prospect of the coming, as a very real conceptual possibility, certainly in certain conditions. And England now, or Britain now, not even England, Britain now, this week brought that home very forcefully to me. That this coming. I mean, sometimes you feel like some of these conversations you have with yourself in your work are abstract and, arty, even though they're not.
Yeah. Yeah.
I never feel that that's what they are. I mean, I don't even know what those things mean, but I never feel that's what they are. But sometimes you could tell by talking to somebody, this is how they're reading what you do, like something far removed. and then you have a week like last week, and you think, yeah, okay, yeah, not so far at all, actually. Not so far removed. I mean, sorry, go on.
Yeah. I think that it's quite tangible, and in as far as abstraction goes,
Mm,
that the works and also the presentations, the installations are very, very tangible.
mm,
And I'm also thinking about all of for instance, when I saw the Vertigo Sea in Barcelona,
mm,
and I came out of there, my head was just spinning because all of a sudden, it's like all this sea diving, by, Nat Geo, photographers and scientists, what are they finding?
mm,
You know, um, it's all is still there too, and I'm thinking that okay, they should see this film because when you go into the deep ocean, you find these things as well, these histories, but
mm,
it's just that now it's in the archive, right? Um, And this is something that I want to ask you. This idea of sort of like someone elsewhere has called it mining the archive.
Mm,
And so like a kind of regurgitation
mm,
and looking at it again and then putting all of them together. Um, is this something that came naturally to you as a function of that, being here and then elsewhere and then back and forth? Or is it
mm.
like something that just naturally or, as a consequence of, can
Yeah,
you speak to that a bit?
yeah. No, I hear what you say. I mean, um, even the things that come naturally to you, you still have to work out their implications.
Mhm.
You know, because a lot of things come very naturally to you, but you're not necessarily, as a person, always aware of the implications of them.
Yeah.
You know, so I always had the sense of the appeal of the archival, for instance.
Yeah.
But not necessarily why it might be necessary to do work with it.
Mhm.
Um, in other words, it's not an either or. You can have both. You can have some things that come naturally that you also then have to still work on. And in my case, that's definitely the case. But there's also this sense that uh, living in a country where there are living in a country and a culture where there are very few monuments that attest to your existence. Um, it starts off initially as troubling, a recognition, and then slowly becomes an understanding. You think, well, actually, yeah, this is how diasporas are. Jewish, African, or otherwise.
Yeah.
They take shape in spaces where they are minor cultures. Uh,
And it's not a contradiction or schizophrenia or whatever. It's just what it is.
that's just what it is, right? Because it only becomes, a contradiction or a schizophrenic condition if you do not, if you're not attentive to the other ways in which their lives are being underscored, underwritten, inscribed, etc., by their presence, their bodies, their
Mm.
voices, if you miss all of that,
Yeah.
then you're missing large sections of, you know what I mean? In other words, the way in which one reads a society cannot just be in terms of the tangibles and the monumental, as stone and concrete and bricks and so on.
And the eventful.
Yeah, it has to be other things. It really
Yeah.
has to be, you have to read them almost in, if those things suggest a kind of horizontal reading, you have to almost read them longitudinally or vice versa. In other words, whatever the shape of reading suggested by the monument as tangible entity is, one has to go for the opposite as well, because it's only at the crossroads between the two, in the lacunae, the one would
Yeah.
find the so-called lacunae,
Mm-hmm.
one would
Mm-hmm.
find all
Mm-hmm.
this other stuff. It's in those ways that the archival becomes important. It's in those ways as affirmation, as indictment almost, if you will, but as underscore, for other ways of understanding presence.
Yeah. I really like, how you've associated the visceral, the body experience
Mm,
in relation to presence,
mm.
this idea of presence, but also I like to think of it in a continuous term, presencing.
Yeah,
That is, it's not going away. It's not in the past, it's not in the future, it is now.
yeah.
And I think it's that part. You say the coming,
Mm,
there is always that idea of coming, but it's also the becoming.
mm,
It's either that, the black body is project or the black person is
mm.
projected into a place where I think about that in terms of how what is expected of in the narrative or the storytelling or the way we think about, for example, Africa. is that
mm,
it has to be eventful.
mm,
And, if it is not something resolved into a foreseeable outcome or
mm.
a measurable outcome, actually, measurable is the one they actually, measurable outcome, then
Indeed.
it is not tangible.
No.
And you are suggesting, in fact, your work has been like this, you know, um, you know, long suggestion that it is important that we look at, all this in between spaces and all these ways that we are present. It is
Mm,
not something that is deferred,
mm.
or uh, divided into a dichotomy between what is and what is the schizophrenic aspect of it. It is all one playing out in the present, in the same body.
Yeah,
Um,
but the present is always clearly for me, and as in the work in particular, always appears precariously balanced between some sense of a kind of earlier trauma and an unspoken future, and that's important to say because the garments of the present are always stitched by cloths and threads from a variety of elsewheres, usually temporary, in the temporary sense, temporal sense, temporal elsewheres,
mhm.
Um, I mean, I look at your room, you look at my room now where we're sitting, and you can just see, the presence of what I'm talking about. So it is always important, it seems to me, to be agnostic about the hubris claims of the present. Not because one wants to live in the past or is a science fiction addict and just wants future stuff, but very literally, the present is, a space of precarity, where things have momentarily arrived to make some sense, on their way elsewhere, and when you talk about the presenting, or the use of archiving, that's what I take from it. I have this very extractive relation with, you know, um, with the past and the present.
Wow.
One tries to get as much, in the Catherine Yusuf sense. One tries to extract as much out of, the present by suggesting the ways in which it is itself just a bus station,
Yeah, yeah.
um, and if you've taken that much from the work, then thank you, because some of it is the thinking behind it, if you like.
Mhm. And so my last question
I thought there might be one.
is my last question is, I've always wondered. So all of these moving parts, again, I come back to this idea of the moving part because that's really what it is. Um, Back and forth, going here and there, and trying to really grapple with all the contradictions and all the complexities, and while preserving the nuances of it and not being essentialist in nature. Um, how have you been able to keep all of your work one after the other fresh and engaging, still in having the same discourse, or treating the same themes, but keeping it ever fresh and ever, you know timely and relevant? How? I mean, and this question is in relation to you as a person, in your worldview, in your way of being in the world. How are you able to arrive at that?
I want things to play uh, productive roles in my life. So whatever the subject is, at some point, it needs to completely take over the life. It needs to be like the only thing I think, care about. Because at that point, um, it starts to ask questions of me. And in trying to answer those questions, I give it something. And it's that, you know, alchemy, bacon-like alchemy of reflection and counter-reflection, dialogue between you and historical objects or narrative and so on, that something emerges, really, so I'm almost there for the next one. At some point you have to just go, okay, all the other stuff from the pavilion, for instance, you must go. You really have to go, because I can't, the hotel has to be emptied for, for other people to come in and live, and I need the space to clean it up. So but at some point they do, or some hang on longer than others, but most works at some point do say goodbye, because without that you can't move on to the next one. You literally end up making the next work as a coda, a supplement, and I try to not do that. They may well end up being that, but I try to be more considerate of each piece by treating it equally. It doesn't matter whether it's a 10-minute thing or a pavilion. It has to have that time. So yeah, if you ask me that what personally that does, yeah, that would be how we arrive at what you're describing. I mean, I don't see that, so you have to tell me that's what you see.
Yeah, I mean, when you said by treating it equally, it rang like it's like, oh, by treating it with love, with all the love that I can muster at that point in time.
No, I definitely want each piece to leave as if the questions it came into my life with were ones that we rummaged around and with, and that when they left, we had arrived at some junction of either answering it or realizing that it can't be answered in its present form. So, we've changed it, or, but something, I've been touched in some way by it, and vice versa. So the ones, as they leave the door, I know that I've given it due consideration, due thought, and yes, by implication, love as well, because I've never done anything that I hated. I've been fortunate enough never to have done anything, well, maybe one film, but that's
Wow. That I'm gonna take for myself. I'm gonna take for myself, like, okay, that's the way to go.
yeah,
You have to
absolutely.
consider,
Absolutely.
you really
It,
have
it,
to
it,
love it.
it has cost, I have to tell you, my brother. Because what you love is not necessarily always what somebody else is going to love, and
Ah,
that's where the problem comes. But
ah,
I've tried to not let anything other than just the love of the thing be the consideration, which meant that for long periods of time, we weren't always the most welcomed or the most remunerated or the most, do you know what I mean? But you have to
yes.
accept that. If you want to do something you want to do, then you have to accept that other people might not want you to do that. And it's their prerogative and their right, as
Wow.
to stop you, that's fine. But it does have its cost. It will have its cost for sure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, John. I just want to say that for the listeners, many of them young artists from the continent listening, they are treating this work as a pedagogy. So thank you so much for this. And you know, on the other end, your work is like a treasure trove for for many of us in understanding how to sort of like proceed, into as we go further into this 21st century. So yeah, I just want to say really thank you
Many,
for this conversation.
many thanks, Emeka. Yeah, this
Yeah.
is a very stimulating conversation for me too. Take care.
Yes, and I feel like, this is like part one. I might come back to you in the future for a part two. So yes,
No problem.
but
No
this is
problem.
great. This has been really, really wonderful.
Bye, Emeka. Take
All
care.
right. Take care. All
Thanks
right.
for the story.
Bye bye. Yeah. Yeah.